Come sit here with me, near this fire that is already burning low. Bring your quiet and your time, because the story I carry in my chest is not small, nor can it be told in a hurry. I always believed that some truths should remain hidden until we left this world, but the heart is a restless place. No matter how much we want to keep things secret, there comes a moment when the weight grows so large it no longer fits inside us. That was how it was with me. I spent my whole life believing that some pains should be swept under the rug. That shame would fade with time. But I learned, when there was no turning back, that some hurts must be spoken, or they will slowly kill us from within. Before I start, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that my story is reaching different places. I was not a young girl when it all happened. I had already seen many things, had known other fears, but no fright prepared me for the day my sister, the very same one who had grown up with me under the same roof, looked into my eyes and told me what she had done. When I think of that moment, I can still feel the ground slipping away from my feet, because life has those traps. Sometimes the blow comes from where you least expect it. My sister and I were different in almost everything. I had always been the quiet one, the one who took care of the chores, who did not meddle in others' talk. She, on the other hand, had a bright laugh, a joy that drew everyone near. Since childhood, whenever she arrived, everything around seemed livelier. I liked that about her. I liked it so much that I was often the first to defend her when anyone criticized her ways. I would say it was only freedom, a sign of a good heart. Never did I think that same heart could hurt me so deeply. In those times, families lived close together. Doors stayed open. Women helped one another. It was common for sisters to visit without ceremony, to appear without warning, to walk into each other's kitchens as if it were their own home. And so, for many years, my sister came and went through my door, bringing news, telling stories, helping roll the cornmeal cakes I sold to earn extra money. I thought her presence was a gift. I never imagined it would become the bitterest memory of my life. My marriage was not perfect, but I believed it was true. When I married, I made promises I took seriously. I promised to be a companion in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health. My husband was not a man of grand gestures. He was quiet, a bit hard, but he always did his duty to keep the house and respect my place in it, or so I believed. I took pride in saying we had built everything together. Every roof tile, every patch of cultivated land seemed proof of our union. I thought that was love. The illness came upon my sister suddenly, a fever that would not break, a weariness that spread through her body. I went every day to see her. I brought warm broth, words of comfort. I sat by the bed, stroking her hair the way I did when we were girls. I did not know she was carrying another burden, far heavier than her sickness. I did not suspect that, while I prayed to God not to take her too soon, she was gathering courage to tell me the thing I most feared to hear. On the eve of the day she left, I came to her house at dusk. The room was silent, only the creak of the floorboards when someone passed in the hallway. I approached slowly. She was pale, her eyes deep as if already seeing another world. When she felt my hand in hers, she opened her eyes and took a long breath. I thought it was only another sigh of weariness, but in that moment, she began to cry, a soft crying that seemed to come from her soul. I stroked her face, trying to calm her. I asked what was wrong, if the pain was too great. That was when she spoke. The words came in a thin voice, nearly breaking in the air. She said she needed my forgiveness before leaving, that she had done something that shamed her, something she never had the courage to confess while she still had strength. My chest turned cold. I asked what she was speaking of. That was when she looked at me, with those eyes so like my own, and said she had lain with my husband, that it was a mistake, a weakness, that she had never meant to take anything from me but could not stop herself, and that, before leaving this world, she needed me to know the truth. I do not remember answering anything. The pain was so great it seemed my body turned deaf. All I felt was my heart beating too hard, as if it might break me open. I wanted to stand, to run away, to pretend it was not happening, but I could not. I sat there holding her hand while her life was fading and my faith in people died along with it. That night, I returned home without feeling my steps. I did not cry. I did not scream. I only lay on the empty bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to understand how the two people I loved most could have lied to me that way. And no matter how I searched for answers, I found none. Because there are questions life never answers. Only time brings any relief. And even so, it never erases it. That is why today, after so many years, I decided to tell this story. Because keeping that secret only served to keep me company on sleepless nights. Perhaps in speaking it, I can finally give some rest to what remains of my heart. In those days, marrying was a serious thing. There was none of this long courting you see now, nor was it allowed for a young woman to spend much time talking with a man without a commitment. When your grandfather came to our door, bringing a bunch of wildflowers and a look that mixed respect with shyness, my father looked him straight in the eye before he gave permission for him to come closer to me. There were days of conversation on the porch, always with someone nearby, because that was how it was done. But even with all that watchfulness, I felt my heart grow warm every time he arrived. He was not a man of fancy words. His speech was few and plain. He always said he wanted to build a family, that he respected my character, and that he was not only looking for beauty. I listened quietly, my head lowered, but inside I was already dreaming of the day I would wear white. I did not have many belongings. My trousseau fit into a small chest my mother had inherited from her own mother. But inside that chest was all that mattered. Some embroidered dishcloths, a Sunday dress, a pair of sheets, and the hope of a decent life. The proposal came on a Sunday afternoon. After dinner, he called my father aside to speak in a corner of the yard. I held my breath in my chest, pretending to sweep the floor. My mother looked at me and smiled, as if she knew everything without needing to say a word. When the two of them returned, my father said he was a good man, that he had strong arms and the courage to face whatever was needed. Then, with his hands damp with sweat, he came over to me and asked if I would accept to be his wife. I lowered my head and said yes. That was all. There were no tight embraces or tears. But in that moment, I felt my life had taken another path. The preparations were simple. There was no money for a big celebration. Each neighbor brought a little something. One donated a chicken, another lent us the chairs, another baked a cake with flour I had saved up for months. My dress was sewn by my mother, whose hands were like magic. It was made of raw cotton, with a blue ribbon at the waist. When I tried it on, I felt beautiful in a way I never had before. I thought he would find me beautiful too, and he did. On the day of the wedding, when I stepped into the church, I saw his eyes shining, and that was enough for me. The ceremony was held in the small chapel on the hill. It was a simple place, with wooden benches and walls already peeling. But to me, it looked like the most beautiful temple in the world. The priest spoke about patience, about the importance of walking together even when the road was full of stones. I listened to every word as if carving a promise into my heart. When the time came for the rings, my hands trembled so much I nearly let his slip to the floor. He smiled and pressed my fingers gently, as if to say everything would be all right. After Mass, we returned home in silence, walking side by side along the dirt road. The wind carried the smell of the fields, and I felt my story was beginning. At that moment, I did not suspect that one day I would walk that same road alone, carrying another kind of silence inside me. Our house was small, built of light wood, with only one window. That first night, I fixed our room the best I could. I put some flowers in a clay pot, folded the blanket, and kept the lamp burning until sleep came. He sat down beside me, placed his hand over mine, and said we would do our best to be happy. I believed him, because in those times, I thought it was enough to want love in order to keep it alive. The first months were filled with much work. We woke up early, while it was still dark, to tend the fields and the animals. I went down to the river to wash clothes, and spent that time thinking of all I wished to build. A bigger kitchen, a yard full of flowers, children running through the house. I never dreamed of wealth. My only wish was for peace and the certainty that I was loved. Sometimes, when he came home from labor and sat down to eat, I would watch his tired face. It was a face that, in those days, gave me comfort. I told myself he was a good man, and for a long time, I believed it without question. My sister would come to visit almost every week. She liked to bring news, to share recipes, to laugh loudly while she helped me with the chores. I thought it was good to have her company. When the two of them talked, I felt no discomfort. On the contrary, I was proud to have dear people close to us. Never did it cross my mind that one day that friendship would step beyond the line of respect. Never did I imagine that behind her laughter another feeling was growing. In those times, everything seemed in order. Each day had its labor, each night its rest. I did not know that even with a firm routine, the human heart can go astray without warning. I believed fidelity was a natural part of life, that it was enough to care well for the house and for the husband to keep everything in harmony. That certainty was what kept me calm for so long. A calm that, looking back, I see was made of innocence. I do not tell this with bitterness. This story did not bring only pain. It also taught me to see that no one owns another's feelings, that we can be companions, careful, present, and still not be enough to prevent someone's weakness. It took me many years to understand this, but in those days, I knew nothing. I only wanted to be happy with him, in our little corner of the world. If I could return to those first days, perhaps I would tell that young woman, preparing to marry, that life does not always keep the promises it makes. But I would also say that even the most painful stories teach us something worth holding on to. I had no way of knowing what lay ahead, but in the beginning, I was only a woman who believed love would be enough. My sister and I were so different, it seemed God had given the same mother to raise two opposite souls. While I was quiet, always keeping to my corner, she carried a joy that could not be contained in her chest. Since she was a girl, she was the one who would strike up conversation with anyone, who could tell a story so well that even the sternest man would end up laughing. I, always somewhat wary, liked to listen. I would sit nearby, pretending to sew, just so I would not miss a single detail of the tales she made up or recalled. In those days, there was no other young woman with such energy. If there was news of a gathering or a prayer meeting, she was the first to be combing her long hair, straightening her dress, and running out the door. I would watch from the window, feeling a mixture of admiration and concern. I feared that so much cheerfulness would draw envy. I feared that some man, seeing her easy laughter, might confuse freedom with shamelessness. But my mother always said each person has their own nature and that God does not make anyone the same. I kept those words in my heart whenever my mind began to worry without reason. When I married, I thought our bond would change. I believed that, busy with my household and all the chores, I would have less time for her. But it was not so. If before we saw each other almost every day, after my wedding, she began to visit even more. She would arrive with a parcel of warm bread, with a handful of fresh beans, with some embroidery she insisted on giving me. I thought that care was beautiful. It felt as if she wished to prove that, even with different paths, we would never stop being sisters. She liked to sit on my wooden bench, right by the kitchen door, and tell all the news from around the neighborhood. While I washed dishes or mended a shirt, she filled the house with her talk. She would say I needed to find distraction, that a woman could not live only for her chores. I would smile, a little embarrassed, because in my mind, a respectable woman looked first to her duty. But deep down, I enjoyed her presence. It was a way not to feel so alone. My husband also seemed to appreciate her company. When he came back from the fields and saw her there, he would smile and say the house felt more lively. I thought nothing of it. How could I? She was my own blood. She had been my confidant for as long as I could remember. It was with her that I had shared the straw mattress in childhood, that I cried over my first disappointments, that I confided my fears of growing up and losing our closeness. Never did it cross my mind that one day that bond would become a burden. There came a time when she began to appear nearly every evening. She would say it was because of her route home, that she came from visiting someone else and stopped to rest on my porch before carrying on. I believed her. I had no reason to doubt. I was so sure of her heart that I did not notice when, now and then, she stayed longer than she needed, or when her gaze lingered too long on my husband's face. I thought it was only the way a younger sister looked for approval, and for a long while, that was all I saw. When she was ill, it was to me she came to be cared for. She brought her fevers more than once and settled into my bed, asking for a cup of lemon balm tea. I would sit beside her, holding her cold hand, remembering when we were children. I would think of how she had always been fragile of body and strong of spirit. That is why, when she fell truly sick, I spared no effort. I spent days and nights tending her, bringing broth, whispering prayers that God would have mercy. Never did I imagine that in that bed she was keeping a secret that would change everything. I do not tell these memories with bitterness. Even after everything, I still hold in my heart the kindness she gave me on good days, because my sister was not only the woman who betrayed me, she was also the little girl who taught me to braid my doll's hair, who shared with me the last piece of cake, who wept with me when our mother was ill. It took me many years to understand that the human heart is never entirely good nor entirely bad. It is made of fragments, of moments, of choices both right and wrong. And in her story with me, there was all of that. When she was gone, I was left with two kinds of longing. One was for the sister I loved, the other was for the woman I could never again trust. And that second kind of longing hurt more, because it was made of everything that might have been, but was not. I used to think the greatest sorrow would be loneliness, but I learned that what wounds most is losing the truth you once swore existed. Today, when I remember her, I do not see only the betrayal. I also see the life we shared. I see the two of us running in the yard, laughing at foolish things. I see the afternoon we sat together sewing my wedding dress. I see the woman who, despite everything, also loved me in her way. And if telling this still brings pain, it is because my memory carries the weight of things that have no explanation. I often say that a woman's heart senses before her reason understands. It was so with me. Before my eyes ever saw any proof, my heart already knew something was wrong, but I did not want to believe it. It was easier to keep thinking that everything was well than to admit that my trust was slowly breaking apart. The first sign came on a rainy afternoon. I had gone out to gather firewood, and when I returned, I found the two of them sitting at the table. She had come to bring some eggs. She said she only stopped by to leave them and would be on her way. But as I stepped inside, I felt that the way they looked at each other was not as it used to be. It was as if there had been a conversation interrupted, something they did not want me to hear. When they noticed me, she quickly stood up, smoothed her hair, and said she would leave at once. I tried not to think anything of it. I wanted to believe it was only my imagination, but my heart was restless. After that, I began to notice small changes. He came home later from the fields. He said he had stopped to help a neighbor, that he needed to mend a fence. When he sat down to eat, he seemed distracted, as if his thoughts were far away. I asked if something worried him, and he told me it was only tiredness. I pretended to believe him, but inside I was no longer so sure. My sister had changed as well. Before, she would arrive laughing, her presence filling the house with chatter, but she began to come more quietly. Many times, she kept her eyes lowered, avoiding meeting my gaze. When I asked if she was well, she would say yes, but her voice was no longer the same. I felt there was something she did not want to confess. Even so, I chose to keep silent. I was afraid of what I might discover if I pressed her to speak. One day, I was sweeping the yard when I saw the two of them talking by the gate. He held her arm, as if trying to keep her from leaving. She was crying, and he was saying something I could not hear. When they noticed me watching, they stepped apart quickly. She passed by me without lifting her face. He walked into the house without a word. It was then that my chest tightened in a way I had never felt before. That night, I took a long time to fall asleep. I lay there with my eyes open, listening to the rain beating on the roof. I asked God if I was going mad, if all of it was only fantasy. But my soul seemed to warn me it was true. I remembered every detail, the glances, the silences, the restrained gestures. All of it formed a picture I did not wish to see. The next morning, he left early. He said he needed to go to the mill to fetch flour. When I was alone, I sat on the edge of the bed and wept softly. I knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. It was as if the thread that held my life together had begun to unravel, stitch by stitch. I told no one what I saw. Not even my mother knew. I was ashamed. Ashamed to seem suspicious. Ashamed to admit that my home was coming apart. I thought that if I kept silent and pretended, perhaps everything would return to how it had been. I wished to believe it was only a passing weakness, but deep inside, I already knew it would not pass. As the days went by, the people around us began to notice what deep down I already knew. In those times, the neighbors did not need much to piece together hints and spread talk. All it took was a glance exchanged, a visit at the wrong hour, an uneasy silence. And so, little by little, the voices began to reach me. At first, they came in the form of concern. A neighbor who often brought me cassava vines showed up with eyes full of pity and said I ought to pay attention, that folks were saying my sister lingered longer than she needed in my house. I thanked her visit, pretended not to understand her meaning, and shut the door as soon as she was gone. My heart was beating so hard it seemed it might leap from my chest, but my mind still insisted on not believing. Then they came in the form of insinuation. Another woman, who was never known for subtlety, told me outright that it would be wise to watch what was happening under my own roof. I felt my face grow hot, my blood rise. I wanted to answer, to shout that it was a lie, that my sister would never do such a thing. But no voice came out, because inside me I already knew there was a sting of truth in those words, and that doubt gnawed at me worse than any gossip ever could. When night came and I lay down to sleep, I kept recalling each of those conversations. The shame twisted my stomach. I felt small, as though the whole world knew something I did not have the courage to face. I whispered prayers, asking God to take that thought away from me. But the next morning, all it took was to look at his face or into her eyes to feel it all over again. The worst was that I could not tell anyone. If I spoke, the story would gather strength. The neighbors would make a celebration out of my misery. So I kept silent. I went on pretending I saw nothing, heard nothing, that everything was as it always had been. But inside, I was no longer the same. My heart was weary of fighting against what everyone else seemed to see so clearly. One day, I found my mother out in the yard. She looked at me with a sorrowful gaze, as if she guessed my suffering. She squeezed my hand and told me that life does not always turn out the way we dream, that sometimes disappointment comes from those we least expect. I felt my eyes fill with tears, but I did not cry in front of her. I was ashamed to show my weakness. I waited until she had gone to lean against the trunk of the orange tree and let the pain come out in silence. It was after that conversation that I understood there was no use denying any longer. I needed to know the truth, however bitter it might be. I did not want to keep living in that uncertainty, that torment. I decided that the day would come when I would ask, face to face, what had happened between the two of them. But at that moment, I still did not have the courage. It was easier to pretend not to know than to risk hearing the confirmation. Meanwhile, the voices kept echoing around me. Every neighbor who passed by my door seemed to carry in her eyes the same question. How long will she endure this charade? And even I did not know the answer. I thought I had time. I believed that someday, when courage had finally settled inside my chest, I would ask everything that hurt me in silence. But life does not wait for us to be ready. And when the hour came to hear the truth, I had no choice. It was death itself that brought the confession I never wanted to hear. My sister began to truly fall ill in a cold winter, the sort that seems never to end. At first, it was a fever that no tea could ease. Then came a weariness so deep she could scarcely rise from bed. I went to see her every day, bringing warm broth and passing my hand over her face, trying to bring her some comfort. Even with all I already suspected, my heart was still full of care for her, because the love of blood does not vanish just because the heart has been wounded. In those times, no one spoke of any grave illness. They only said it was weakness of the body. But I felt, in the way a woman feels, that she did not have much time left, and with life slipping away so quickly, it seemed she also began to hurry to set things right. It was on a gray afternoon that she asked me to stay alone with her. I was arranging her blanket when I heard her voice call my name, soft, as if she feared she would not be able to finish what she had to say. I came closer and sat on the edge of the bed. She held my hand tightly, with a strength I did not know she still had in her. I looked into her eyes, and in that instant I knew I was about to hear what my heart most dreaded. Even so, I did not draw back, because the pain that already lived inside me also longed for answers. She said she needed to tell me something before she left this world, that she did not wish to carry the weight of what she had done to me across to the other side. I felt my breath leave me. I asked her to speak at once, to pull it out from inside herself. Then she began. She said that what had happened had never been planned, that it was a weakness that began slowly on the days she came to visit me. That first, it was only too much talking, then a hand resting on an arm, then a stolen kiss, and that by the time they realized it, they were already tangled in a feeling neither of them had the courage to break. I sat there, unable to draw breath. My hand was still in hers, but I could no longer feel anything. It was as if my body had turned to stone. She was crying, saying she loved me, that she regretted every moment, that she knew I would never again trust her. I did not say a word. Inside me, it was as if everything were collapsing. Every good memory mixed with that bitter confession, every shared laughter, every embrace, all of it seemed a lie. She finished by saying she needed my forgiveness, that she did not want to leave without knowing whether one day I might pray for her soul without bitterness. I closed my eyes. I took a deep breath, trying to find inside me some last scrap of pity. But in that moment, there was nothing but pain. A pain so immense it tore me apart. I opened my eyes and simply said that I did not know, that perhaps someday I would be able to forgive, but that in that instant, I could not promise it. She squeezed my hand once more and said she understood, and I believe she did understand. Because when she let go of my fingers, her eyes were already closing, as though she had finally found some rest. I remained sitting there, listening to the sound of her breathing grow weaker, until silence filled the room completely. That day, when I returned home, I did not cry. I had the feeling that my chest was so full that not a single tear could fit. I only knew that, of all the sorrows a woman can feel, hearing the truth too late is one of those that leaves the deepest wound. When she passed, her house grew so quiet it seemed the whole world had stopped breathing. I remained sitting by her bedside for a long time, thinking of nothing. It was not an ordinary sadness. It was a strange mixture of relief, guilt, and a pain that had no edge. Relief because at last I had the truth, guilt for not having managed to forgive her before her eyes closed, and pain because, despite everything, she was still my sister. That afternoon, I walked home slowly. The dirt road seemed longer than ever. The cold wind blew against my face, and I did not bother to wipe away the tears that ran down. Each step reminded me that from that day forward, I would have to live with that memory. A confession no one else had heard, that remained only between the two of us and God. When I came inside, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head bowed. I knew he had already heard the news of her death, but I did not know if he understood that I now also knew everything. The silence between us was so heavy it seemed to fill every corner. I closed the door, laid my shawl on the chair, and stood there, waiting for him to raise his eyes. But he did not. He stayed still, as though he no longer had strength for anything. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to scream, to say he had destroyed everything I believed in, but no words came. I could only look at that man, who once had been my companion and now was almost a stranger. The same man who had shared with me every accomplishment, every cold night, every promise made before the altar. I tried to find inside myself some last trace of affection, some scrap of respect, but I found nothing. Everything was covered by a void so deep I thought I would never feel anything again. He lifted his head slowly, as though he knew the hour had come to hear his sentence. His eyes were red. I do not know if from crying or from shame. We stared at each other for what felt like far too long. Then, in a thin voice, he said he was sorry, that he could not explain how it had begun, that he had not had the courage to confess while she lived. I listened to everything without interrupting. There were no more questions I wished to ask. The only thing I wanted was for that weight to leave my chest. When he finished, I lowered my eyes and drew a long breath. I told him I had no answer, that perhaps in time I would be able to forgive, but that in that moment I could not give him or myself that promise. I said I needed to be alone, that I did not know what I would do with my days. He nodded and went out, leaving the door ajar as if he hoped I would call him back. But I did not, because in that moment I wanted only silence. That night I could not sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed and prayed. I asked God to help me find a way to go on after everything. I knew forgiveness was an obligation the church taught, but no one had ever told me that forgiving could hurt so much, that forgiving was not forgetting, nor pretending nothing had happened. It was accepting that the wound existed and moving forward all the same. I did not know if I could do it, but deep inside, I wished someday I would wake without feeling so much bitterness. Time would teach me that forgiveness does not happen all at once. It is like a plant you water every day, not knowing when it will sprout. And in those early days, I did not even have the courage to plant the seed. His silence was the hardest pain to bear. It was not the shouting, nor the explanation that never came. It was the profound silence, the kind of silence that tears you apart more than any spoken word. He did not seek me out. He did not try to explain himself. He just withdrew, as if he wanted the world to spin again without him. I already knew he felt shame. Who wouldn't? But what hurt me more was the feeling that he didn't care enough to ask for forgiveness. I wanted to hear from him that he regretted it, that he couldn't bear the shame, that I still meant something to him. But instead, he shut himself off, staying in the house as though his pain were greater than mine. In the days following her confession, I saw him more absent than ever. He would lock himself in the room, spending hours staring out the window, as if searching for answers in the horizon. I would call him to the table, but he hardly ate. Sometimes I would find him standing on the porch, looking down the road, without saying a word. He was there, but he wasn't present. I felt as though he had already left, but with his body still there, like a ghost, refusing to depart. I started to understand, in a way that made my suffering worse, that his silence was not only shame, it was an escape. He didn't want to face what he had done. He didn't want to see the pain he had caused in my eyes. Perhaps he thought that by ignoring me, he was sparing us both the shame of speaking about what had happened. But in reality, he was only pushing me further into solitude. I tried to draw him into conversation. I tried to show him that I needed him to speak, that I needed to hear from his lips how he felt. I went to the door of the room, and with a trembling voice, begged him to talk to me. I asked why he had done what he did, how he could have lost his way like that. He looked at me with no reaction and only said, "I don't know." And with those 3 words, the world seemed to collapse around me again. He refused to explain. And the cruelest part was that deep down, he also knew that words couldn't fix the damage. But I wanted to hear it. I wanted to hear him say that if he could go back in time, he would have chosen the right path. But he never told me that. Time passed, and the house grew more and more silent. I went on with the daily chores, but something inside me had broken. The home that once felt like a refuge now seemed like a prison. I asked myself if he also missed what we had, or if deep down, he felt relieved that he no longer had to carry the weight of lies. When I saw myself in the mirror, I wondered who I was now. The betrayed woman? The wife who still tried to hold on to her marriage? Or the woman who, without meaning to, had started to live alone within a relationship? I didn't know. The worst silence was the one he didn't give me. He could have said anything, but instead, he remained closed off, as if by remaining silent, he could erase everything that had happened. I began to believe he did not understand the magnitude of what he had done. What he did wasn't just to my body, but to my soul, and he seemed unaware. I no longer wanted to live like this. I needed some explanation, but he refused to give me one. His silence afflicted me so much that I began to wonder if he even felt the pain I felt. Perhaps he didn't understand. Perhaps it was easier to stay quiet and wait for time to heal everything. But for me, time did not heal a thing. Time only made the wounds hide, and the unspoken words piled up like stones inside me. I felt that with each passing day, the pain grew greater. He distanced himself further, and I found myself lost, waiting for something that would never come. Every time he looked out to the horizon, I felt as though he was looking to a future where I no longer existed. His silence was the worst punishment I could have received, because he did not give me the chance to choose, to forgive him or not, to continue with him or move on alone. He left me in endless waiting, not knowing what to do, not knowing what he really wanted from me. When the words began to spread, the house that had once been my refuge turned into a stage where everyone, in one way or another, started to offer their opinions. What was happening inside my house had now become everyone's business. There wasn't a single person who didn't have something to say about what I should do. And I realized, with a mix of shame and anger, that the judgment didn't come only from those I loved most, but from everyone around us. I knew the gossip wouldn't stop. People began to look at me with pity, with judgment. Some pretended not to know anything, but their silence spoke volumes. They knew, everyone knew. What had once been a home full of warmth and affection was now a place of whispers. And instead of finding comfort in my own tears, I found empty gazes that seemed to ask why I hadn't made a decision yet. Donna Celina, who had always been my friend, was the first to approach me. She came to my door with a quiet voice, almost shy, as if it was a subject she didn't want to touch, but couldn't help but speak about. "My dear, You need to do what's best for you. Don't let life pass you by and take what's yours. I knew she wanted to give me strength, but her words fell on me like stones. I already knew what everyone thought. They wanted me to be strong, but no one knew the pain that I carried inside. At other times, people who had never cared before about what went on inside my home began to approach. Women who never looked at me more than to exchange a simple greeting now began offering me advice as if they were experts on married life. They told me it was natural for him to lose his way, that men were like that, and it was the woman's job to hold the family together. I listened to all of it in silence, with a tight stomach, because each word seemed like a sharp knife. The community didn't give me a break. What was mine, my suffering, had become a topic of speculation for those sitting in the church benches or on their porches. The voices wouldn't stop. And even those people I knew cared for me, those who called themselves my friends, didn't know how to behave. I saw the discomfort in their eyes, the desire to help, but the inability to truly understand the depth of the pain I felt. Some spoke of forgiveness, others of separation. None of them knew what it was like to live in the midst of the pain of betrayal. I found myself alone, not because they weren't around, but because no one truly knew what I was going through. No advice seemed helpful. No words of comfort made me feel any less lost. The whole town was talking, but no one was really listening to me. I knew that, no matter how hard others tried to help, in the end, the decision would be mine alone. I would be the one to bear the weight of choosing what to do with everything that was left. I remember a conversation with Donna Lucia, who, with all her experience, told me something I will never forget. Sometimes we have to look inside and see if forgiveness is for those who wronged us, or if it's for our own soul, so we don't die with the burden. Her words echoed inside me for days. I knew that deep down, forgiving wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. It was about freeing myself from the bitterness that, little by little, began to consume me. That was a hard time, and I spent my days trying to find some way to live with the shame and anger. I no longer knew who I was. I didn't know if I could ever look at him the same way again, or if I could ever forgive him for real. What hurt me most wasn't what he had done, but what he hadn't done afterward. To understand the pain he caused, to ask for forgiveness in a genuine way, and to accept that words couldn't erase the mistakes. The community, in its own way, tried to give me strength, but it also forced me to face my own choices. The voices that told me what to do didn't understand that, deep down, the only words I needed to hear were my own, and those that I most needed, which could only be spoken by me, were stuck at the back of my throat. Time passed, and with it, life began to reorganize itself in ways I never could have imagined. What seemed like the end slowly started to transform into something different. At first, I looked at the passing days and saw only shadows. The pain was too great for me to imagine any form of overcoming, but as time went on, I began to realize that life, no matter how difficult it may be, does not stop. The world moves on, even when you feel broken inside. I no longer knew what it meant to be happy. I had lost trust in love, in others, and, in a way, even in myself. I felt weak, incapable of believing that one day I would be whole again. But I also knew I couldn't continue living like that, immersed in a pain that only seemed to grow. In the first months after everything happened, I focused on getting through the daily routine. That was all I could do. I couldn't depend on him for anything anymore. Every morning became a struggle. Simply getting out of bed became a fight against what was left of myself. But little by little, small things began to give me strength. It was the sunrise, the strength of the wind in the trees, the sound of the rooster crowing in the field. Every detail of simple life, which I had never seen before, now seemed to call me back to the world. I started working more. My fingers, once tired from all the suffering, now occupied themselves with fabric, with the stitch of the sewing. Doing something with my hands gave me a sense of control, of still being able to create something that I wasn't completely lost. The time spent sitting on the bench, with the needle in my hands, was the time I silently rebuilt myself without even knowing. With every piece I finished, with every garment that was ready, I felt I had done something that was mine, something that didn't depend on anyone. And with that, I began to regain my own dignity. Not all at once, not with grand gestures, but little by little. Deep down, I knew that the only way to move forward was to reclaim whatever was left of myself and do so independently. I no longer wanted to be defined by what had happened to me, nor by what others expected me to be. I wanted to just be me, with the pain I carried, but with the strength I was slowly discovering within myself. It was then that he came back to ask for my forgiveness. I no longer knew how to feel. The pain was still there, but something inside me had changed. I no longer expected the answer I had wanted to hear from him. I knew that forgiveness wasn't going to come from him. It had to come from me. He arrived with that look I already knew, the look of someone wanting to return, of someone wanting to start over. He told me he had been wrong, that he knew everything he had done had no explanation. He kneeled before me, hoping that I could forgive him, that I would return to being the woman he loved, but I was no longer the same. The woman I had been before that pain no longer existed. I had transformed. I took a deep breath and with a calm voice told him I didn't know what the future would hold for us, that I didn't know if I could live by his side again. He looked at me as if everything had been lost, but I felt that, in that moment, I had gained something more important, the freedom to choose what I wanted for my life. I didn't say that I forgave him, because I wasn't ready. I said that I still needed time. Time gave me clarity. It gave me space to understand that the pain, no matter how great, didn't have to be the only thing that defined my life. I could look at the future without constantly looking at the past, and that was the beginning of my overcoming. Over time, I began to accept that what had happened couldn't be erased, but that I didn't need to carry the shame or the resentment with me. I learned that, although forgiveness wasn't easy, it was necessary for me to become whole again, not for him, not for others, but for myself. Today, when I look back, I see that overcoming was not a straight line. There were ups and downs, moments when I thought I wouldn't make it. But the truth is, little by little, life regained meaning. The pain turned into learning, and what I thought would destroy me, in reality, strengthened me. And with time, I learned to live with it. Today, when I look back, I no longer feel that sharp pain that seemed to consume me. Time, although it was long, taught me that what breaks us also has the power to strengthen us. What seemed like the end of everything, in reality, became the beginning of something I never could have planned. The suffering I lived through made me understand things I would never have learned any other way. And in the end, the lesson that remains was much deeper than I could have imagined. I learned that, in many situations, we have no control over the choices of others. We can be faithful, loyal, we can give everything of ourselves, but in the end, we cannot prevent the other person from taking the path they chose. I spent so much time blaming myself, thinking I had failed at something. I thought that if I had been more attentive, more affectionate, more careful, he wouldn't have lost his way. But over time, I understood that the only responsibility I had was to take care of my own heart. I couldn't control his failures, but I could control how I dealt with my own. I learned that forgiveness is not a simple act, as they always told me. It is not a button that you press, and everything is solved. Forgiveness is a process, and this process often has no end. You don't forgive in a day or a month. Forgiveness is built every day, every morning, when you decide, no matter how difficult it is, to move forward. With every step you take, the pain diminishes, but forgiveness grows. And it is this way, little by little, that we set ourselves free. I also learned that the pain we carry does not have to stay with us forever. The suffering, no matter how intense it was, does not define who we are. We are not made only of wounds. We can also be made of strength. I, who thought I would never again be able to trust or love, learned that trust can be restored. Not in the way I wanted, perhaps, but in another way. I learned to trust myself first, and that trust was what allowed me, one day, to look at life and realize that, although the mistakes marked me, they didn't stop me from moving forward. The lesson that remains, perhaps the most important of all, is that no one, no matter how much they hurt us, has the power to destroy us. We decide, day after day, what to do with the pain that is imposed on us. We decide whether to stay trapped in it, or, with all the strength we have, to turn that pain into learning, into strength, into freedom. I chose freedom. I chose, even with all the scars, to be the owner of my story. Today, when I remember those days, I no longer feel anger or bitterness, not because I've forgotten, but because I've learned to live with it in a way that strengthened me. What seemed unbearable has become part of me, but it no longer has the power to hurt me. I know that, to get here, it took more than time. It took courage. It took facing the pain head on. And above all, it took learning to forgive myself. What remains at the end of it all is the certainty that life is made of choices, and that, even after so much pain, we can still choose who we want to be. I chose to be someone who doesn't carry grudges, someone who learned to rebuild herself, someone who, even with all the scars, still believes in the possibility of starting over. And that, my dear, was the greatest lesson that remains. If you liked Grandma's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this and share them with other people who might be inspired by this story of overcoming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a similar situation? How did you react? A kiss on the heart from all of you. And until the next story.